Welcome to this week's recap walkthrough. So, week 10, we went through Unit 6, Lecture 1, as well as Unit 6, Lecture 2. So, as always with these, I highly recommend you trying to play the games on your own first, and then coming back here to hear some of the logic behind the answers and any extra sort of points that I wanted to make about these concepts. So, we'll go ahead and get started with Unit 6, Lecture 1. If you haven't yet played the game, pause this walkthrough, go play the game, and come back. All right, so the first question is asking about that 1790 reform legislation that was really spearheaded by Benjamin Rush. And you remember Benjamin Rush was sort of the first person to develop a prisoner advocacy rights group, or prisoner rights advocacy group. And part of this legislation had a lot of pieces, but one thing that wasn't there was this idea of creating a system of parole. Within this 1790 legislation, they got approved renovations to the physical structure of the Walnut Street Jail. They also sort of changed the burden of incarceration from the persons being incarcerated to the state. So now the state was required to pay for food and water. We also see the advancement of sort of prisoner classification. And we see for the first time in the U.S. correctional history where we have a required separation of prisoners by their gender, age, and offense type. The last sort of major thing that the 1790 reform legislation established was that alcohol was now officially banned from being allowed in correctional facilities. Second question is testing your knowledge of those early correctional history prison models. It's asking which of these tended to keep prisoners alone and in their self-contained cell. And so, of the choices we have here, there's only one clear answer, and that's the Pennsylvania model. You'll remember from lecture, the Pennsylvania model was all based on this idea of penance and sort of basically thinking about what you did wrong and why that was sort of bad. And so, under this Pennsylvania model, you were in a single cell and you were self contained, meaning you didn't leave the cell. You were only allowed to talk to correctional officials and guards when asked to talk. Other than that, you were in a completely silent system. These types of prisons that are based on the Pennsylvania model were some of the most expensive and costly in the New World. Competing model at the time was the New York system, otherwise known as the Auburn system. And this is what we tend to think of as prisons today, really. Multiple levels and using what's known as a congregate work system, where they share a small sleeping space, at least two people in each cell, and then they have one larger space that all the inmates use for sort of living and working and eating and things like that. And then the Southern system is sort of that more agrarian focused system. You'll remember from lecture we talked about the idea of using convict lease systems as well as prison farms because of the agrarian nature of Southern society. The third question is asking again to sort of think about these early correctional history models and recall sort of which one was most cost effective. And the one that was most cost effective was the one that could hold more prisoners. And that was the Auburn or New York system model. Remember, this model could hold more prisoners, and at the time, they could be used for labor to create goods to sell. So the Auburn and New York model prisons in the early days were self sustaining. So the more prisoners you had, you could make more money running the prison. The final question for this first lecture recap has to do with sort of the rising costs we've seen in incarceration over time. It's asking you to identify which one really doesn't belong. All these things are true except for the separation of prisoners by gender, age, and offense. Those really aren't the primary reason for the rising costs of incarceration. In lecture, we talked about the idea that we sort of moved away in ideology from Lombroso era, where we think criminals are born, to the idea that we can change them while they're there. So we started offering more educational rehabilitation programs. We see the end of civil death, meaning that they get to keep some of their civil rights even while incarcerated, which increases costs. We see a rapid rise in people incarcerated, which leads to needing more prisons because we have more prisoners to house. We see a change from what we saw in the Auburn model, where prisons can't produce goods for sale directly to the public because it was affecting small businesses during the Great Depression. And we also see that just in general, the costs of doing corrections represent the largest category or the fastest growing category of state budgets. And we're spending on average over $50 billion a year in corrections. So that sort of wraps us up for Unit 1, Lecture 1. And now we'll switch gears and move over into talking about the Unit 2, Lecture 2. Right, so switching gears over into talking about our Lecture 2 that we did this past week. So the first question is sort of asking you to understand who is residing within the jails. And the question is asking, true or false, the majority of inmates housed in jails have been convicted. In fact, this question is false. As you'll know from the text as well as the lecture, the majority of people housed in jails are not yet convicted. They're awaiting trial still. Jails are sort of our broadest category of correctional facility. They serve a lot of purposes, and one of these purposes is to hold people until they make it through their trial. And so the majority of people in jail have not yet been convicted. Question 2 here is asking about what type of jails hold the most inmates. And forgive me for the misclick on my phone here. But there's 3 types we talked about. We talked about Native American jails, federal jails, and city and county jails. The one that holds the most is the city and county jail. And this sort of makes sense when you think about it. There's far more cities and counties in the US than there are federal sites or Native American jails. So just by law of having the more of these in existence, they also hold more of the population. The third question is looking about now moving to focusing on state prisons and sort of what purpose these serve. And the statement reads, state prisons contain both convicted offenders as well as those waiting trial. But as we know, this statement is false. For state prisons, it's only people who have been convicted. It's not people waiting trial like the jails. It's typically people convicted of felony offenses. And typically they're going to be incarcerated for more than a year. Remember, the jails are sort of more short term. It's people less than a year. Prisons is people over a year. And the final question has to deal with the issue of the privatization of prison. And so the statement sort of reads, private prisons are substantially cheaper than state or federally run prisons. And as we talked about in lecture, this is really in fact false. Now, there's this belief that they could be cheaper, but when you dig into why they're cheaper, it sort of deteriorates this argument. Remember, private prisons are able to exclude the costliest offenders. They can exclude people with maximum security classifications. They can exclude people with chronic illnesses, severe disabilities, or limited capacity. Things that make up a bulk of our prison budget. So if they're able to exclude these most expensive prisoners, it's easy to see why on paper they may look cheaper, but in actuality, they aren't cheaper to run than our state or federally run prisons. So that concludes our recap for week 10. Hopefully you've done well in taking these quizzes seriously. If not, hopefully from this recap you're getting a little bit more out of the lecture recordings that you listen to.